Dear church, let's talk sermon construction with Steve Higginbotham. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. Excited to start a new podcast series here at the first of the year talking about sermon construction. And my first guest is Steve Higginbotham. Steve, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. I enjoy it.
Absolutely. We're going to have a 5-part series talking to different preachers about how they put together a sermon. And this is not just for preachers. This is for anyone who is developing a lesson for maybe a Bible class or a sermon or whatever. But we wanted to do this, at least I wanted to do this because I'm fascinated by the different perspectives and the different ways that preachers go about putting together a sermon, taking it from their mind to the pulpit and delivering it on Sunday. And we had you on, we've had you on the podcast several times, but I had you on recently, I guess, a year or two ago, and we talked a little bit about this topic. And I was fascinated by your approach because if I remember correctly, you talked about how you don't really put anything down on paper until like the end of the week, which I think that would drive me mad, but so let's start here. Before we jump in, though, for those who don't know, Steve is the preaching minister at the Carnes Church of Christ, which is Knoxville area. And Steve, I know you've got a lot happening in your world, new grandbaby, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the work there at Carnes, and then personally, what's going on in your life right now.
Yeah, we've been at Carnes for 13 years now, all 13 and a half, close to 14, but we love the work here. It's a great congregation. We have a school of preaching here, and my children live close by, not too far, about an hour and a half. And so we've got some grandbabies we're staying busy with, but we're enjoying it. Yes,
that's fantastic. And how's your health? I know that.
I'm doing well. I mean, I just got back from MD Anderson about a month ago from more scans, and they say I'm clean right now. So they told me to come back in 6 months, which is like a year ahead of schedule on their, spacing out the scans. So that was encouraging too, that they felt confident enough to give it 6 months. So we're plugging along.
Yeah, I mean, great news considering, we talked about this on the podcast too, as, I remember this vividly. It was in August and I was in Target and I get a text from you asking for prayers that you had gotten a pretty grim diagnosis, but that has been how long ago now?
That was 3 years ago, and they had given me 3 months to live 3 years ago. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, yes. Rejoicing there as well. And I'm thankful that we have you around because we love the work that you do. Personally, you have been a friend, a mentor, and love your style and simple approach to Scripture. Yeah. And I love your stuff that you put on Preaching Help. Talk a little bit, plug that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I have a website. I've done it for years. It's called preachinghelp.org. Since I've been sick, I haven't really had the strength and so distracted with other things that I've kind of let it sit for a while. But I'm getting back in the saddle and getting that back up. But there's a host of sermon outlines, biblical articles, those kind of things that are available on that, archived on that website that people can go to.
Yeah, really good resource and tool, especially for young preachers. Yeah, looking for material and things like that. I highly, highly recommend.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. So Steve, you've been doing this a while, and I tell people all the time the more you do it, the easier it gets. I believe. But tell us kind of where you start. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do you come up with ideas for sermons? So talk a little bit about that. Where do you come up with your ideas? How does it start, and how do you get it from your brain to paper and then to the pulpit?
Well, I think one of the things I first start to do is I try to weigh the needs of the congregation and keep a balanced approach. I'm always asking myself, do I need like instructional material? Do I need encouragement? Do I need to, have something more along the line of rebuke? I want to be balanced in my approach, but once I decide what I feel is needed in terms of balance, then I start trying to figure out, what is it that I need to talk about, and how can I do that? The topics often come from reading, from studying my Bible. If you're not studying, you're going to be dry. You've got to read your Bible. And as you read your Bible, you can't help but see things and make connections. So I do a lot of, I read my regular study. I listen to people. I listen to podcasts. There are a host of things that keep my mind engaged that then jump off the page. Well, I'll give you an example. Just yesterday or Sunday, I was reading in Numbers chapter 23 and verse 10, and it says that Balaam, he said this prayer. He said, may let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like his. And that grabbed me, because this guy was unwilling to live for the Lord, but he wanted to die in the Lord. Yeah. And so that got me to thinking, that was just a jumping off place when I read that passage. And I remembered a prayer that I used to pray as a child. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. That's basically what Balaam was praying. If I die tonight, let me be with the Lord. But I like, and this is one of the things that I like to try to do, is I like to look at things from a different angle. Mm-hmm. And I think it causes people to be more attentive. It grabs their attention. And so I looked at the question of, not if I shall die before I wake, but if I shall wake before I die, then what? Huh. How are we going to live our life? Balaam wasn't willing to live for the Lord after that, but how will we, and it was New Year's. So, here we have New Year's. If we die tonight, certainly we would want to be with the Lord, but what if we wake up in the morning? Then what are we going to do? Right. And so from there, I've got the idea, but then I have to look and see, now, is this best expressed in a topical sermon or an expository sermon? Is there a text that just runs with that? Or, so that's kind of the process. But I do a lot of reading. I do a lot of Bible study, and it's from that I get most of my ideas. If you're not reading, if you're not studying, if you're not listening, you're going to be dry. It's going to be a chore every week.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was told to me. The best advice I got when I first started preaching is read. And so yeah. I've tried to continue to do that. And there are some things that I read, and I'll read, half of the book and get what I think I need out of it, and I throw it aside, maybe I read the whole thing and it helps.
I don't read solid all the way through a lot of books, but I pick at different things that I'm interested in.
Yeah, you kind of hunt and peck a little bit, you know. So I love the idea. And by the way, you're trying to approach things from a different angle. Is what I love about your preaching. I recently did an article for the Dixon Post that came from a thought that you had about Eliam in the Bible, and how I think it was many years ago you talked about how David is a man after God's own heart. But how did Eliam probably think about David? Because he was the father of Bathsheba, and he probably had a very different view. And so I love how you do that, how you try to approach things from a different angle. So once you've got that seed, what is your next step? Where do you go from there?
Yeah, well, I go for angles. That's one of the things I'm looking at. We can hear the same story over and over again, that when somebody hears we're going to talk about this, I know that story, and they can shut down and go on a mental vacation.
Yeah.
And I don't want that happening. So what I try to do is I'm preaching the text, but I want to approach the text
Right.
in a fresh, from a fresh perspective. And what it allows you to do is to bring up things that people don't think about, but that are right there. We usually, you mentioned that example, but when we preach on David, we usually talk about the power of lust. We talk about, temptation and all those, the consequences of sin and being found out and all those basic lessons. We've heard them 1,000 times. But when you tell it from a different angle, from a different person's perspective in that story, now, like with Eliam or Eliam, however you say his word, I'm not sure. But with him being Bathsheba's father, David has killed his son-in-law and has violated his daughter. Now, how's he feel about that? And it leads you to a lesson from that text that we never talk about and how hard it is to forgive. We're required to do it, but it's not easy. And Joseph's brothers, we tell the story about Joseph, and that's really easy to talk about. So, we hit the same providence and all those lessons. But if you tell the story from the brothers' perspective, the story of Joseph is a really good lesson about guilt, because as soon as something bad happened, the brothers twice start saying, I knew God was going to get us for this. And they'd been living for a decade with this guilt over what they had done. And so that's where I start. I try to look at whatever the topic is that I'm trying to hit at and see, can I get some fresh perspective, some angles to this that will hold people's attention where they don't just, zone out because, I've heard that, been there, done that. You're not going to tell me anything different.
Yeah.
The other thing that I do is once I get a topic and I prioritize this part of it, and I know that sometimes people don't, and I think it's a big mistake. I prioritize illustrating the sermon. We talk about Jesus being the master teacher, and that's the statement we hear over and over again. Jesus was the master teacher. And so I'm sitting here thinking, well, then why don't we preach like him? Jesus used illustrations. And the Sermon on the Mount takes about 20 minutes to read. So it's about the length of a sermon that we preach today. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had close to 45 illustrations.
Yeah.
You got the book of James. We say it's the most practical book in the Bible. And the book of James has over 40 illustrations in it. And I just think, maybe you weren't old enough, Chris, to live in the day of black and white TV. But I remember as a boy when we finally got our first color television set. Man, it was so exciting because we went from that black and white to color. And I think that what illustrations do is that they put color to the black and white truths in God's word. And it grabs people. They may not remember your sermon, but they'll remember your illustration that brings them back to your sermon. And so I think illustration is really important. And so a big part of my preparation is, I get what I want to talk about, but now how am I going to illustrate that? And I spend a lot of time on that.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. When I first started preaching, I had a comment or two about, you use a lot of illustrations, like maybe condescendingly, you use too many illustrations. And I'm like, well, I mean, Jesus was the master at that. I certainly am not claiming to be him, but if I'm going to preach like him, then I'm going to use a lot of illustrations because that was really a big part of his preaching.
Absolutely. And I've heard people throw off. I've heard people say something along this line. He's not a preacher. He's a storyteller. They may be talking about where did we get the idea that storytelling is not preaching? That's what Jesus did. And if we're telling stories just to, get laughs and and make people feel good that have no spiritual application, well, of course that doesn't have a place in the pulpit. But stories that illustrate truth is really important for people to be able to remember and to apply those spiritual truths that you're talking about.
Yeah, and along those same lines, you hear quite often people make a comment about, well, it's not about entertainment. Well, I get that, but at the same time, you don't hire boring preachers, right? I mean,
Exactly.
there is a factor where you want to hold the audience's attention or the church's attention and help them to make those connections, connect those dots. And I think you can do that very well with an illustration. I do some broadcasting. I do, football and basketball games for one of the high schools here. And one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is ever so often you need to give the score. People listening want to know the score. Don't go long periods of time without a score.
Yeah.
And I think about that in preaching. I don't want to go too long of a period without trying to connect it with an illustration.
I try to have an illustration for every major point in my lesson. And I think you're right. I think when Jesus preached, he had a lot of punchlines that would have had those people laughing at the hypocrisy that he's exposing. They would have laughed at some of the things that Jesus said.
No doubt. So where do you get those illustrations? And along that same line, what resources do you use? I mean, I've kind of gotten away from commentaries. Not really. I don't think. I don't know that it was really something purposeful. But where do you get, or what resources, I should say, do you use outside of Scripture, of course, to put this together?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of good, great illustrations in the Bible itself. But, one of the things that I started doing years ago, and I encourage the guys in the School of Preaching to do as well, but there's a little app on your phone called Flipboard. It's a news aggregator. And what it does, instead of you going out and trying to find things, it brings what you're interested in to your phone. And so I set it up, and I say, I'm interested in Christianity, church, apologetics, a whole list of things. And so every morning I've got a ton of news stories that fall into those categories. And you just flip through the headlines. And by flipping through the headlines, I have found tons and tons of illustrations that just jump off the page at you. I don't read every story, but just flipping the headlines, I'll see something and I'll go, oh, yeah, that's you can do something with that. Yeah. And so that's one of the things. As far as resources, I don't use commentaries hardly at all. And I would suggest that if you do it after you've done your study, don't use them first. I do like to do word studies. I don't usually. I'm not going to talk about Greek. I'm not going to, bring up Greek words in my sermon. Nobody knows what that is anyway. So right. The goal of preaching is to communicate and not to show how smart I am or anything like that. So, but I do use it in my private study to bring out various things that are in the text. It's kind of like digging for gold. You're going to empty a lot of shovels before you finally find some gold. And when you look at a text and you do the word studies in that text, you may not find anything, but you might find something that just like, wow, I've never noticed that before. And so, and those are really good, insightful that people will say, oh, I never knew that. That's interesting. I didn't realize that. So those are some, and I use, different Greek sources for those kind of things. But
Yeah, that's I'm always interested in what people are reading and what are they looking at. One of the things that I always say is it's a good idea to have an illustrations file. So if you come across one and it's where you can print it off, stick it in that file. You never know when you might need it, or maybe even have some sub files with different topic headings that you can place so that when you go to do a sermon on love, well, I have a file for love in my illustrations, and I've got several that I've that I've kept over the years, or, maybe even keep a little journal that you can write down ideas. I liken, maybe this isn't a great analogy, but I like in preaching, kind of like when you hear stand-up comics talk about their routine and how they do things. They get ideas from paying attention. They look around, they see things,
oh, yeah.
and they write them down. And then, when they talk about Jerry Seinfeld, especially when he talks about crafting a joke and, delivering it perfectly and all that. I mean, I'm listening to him thinking, that's a lot like I think when it comes to preaching,
There's so many, and I would really like to do what you did. I just don't have the organization skills to categorize all these things and file them away. But I do have books that I keep with me all the time. This is my latest journal that I have, but I keep these with me all the time. And the ones I've had before are much smaller. I can actually stick them in a pocket or something. But if a thought hits me, I write it down. I'm a techie guy, but I like note-taking with pen and paper. And I have a backlog of these books that I have kept, and I have dozens and dozens of sermon ideas that I still haven't even preached, but it was a thought that hit me. And I think that's really important. I tell the guys in the school of preaching, you've got to start thinking like a preacher. It's easy to see when something happens, it's easy to see that event for what it is. But look at those everyday events and try to find a spiritual application in it. And then you're going to be seeing things that other people don't see. And you're going to be giving them insights that they would never have thought. They're familiar with the story, but that never dawned on them. Right. And those are the kind of things that I like to try to accomplish with those illustrations.
Yeah, you said that about note-taking. I'm the same way, and I'm that way with books. I've got an iPad that has the Kindle app, and I do download books, and I read them from my iPad, but I still like the book where I can write in it and highlight it and all that, because that to me is invaluable. So I'm kind of old school when it comes down. I'm like you. I'm a techie guy. I've got the watch. I've got the iPad. I've got the Mac. All that. But I do like going back to the archaic. Reading the book, underlining and all that kind of stuff.
And I think that by doing that writing and underlining, it even embeds it a little more in your memory.
I think you're right. Yeah. So talk about the process now. So you've got an idea, you're fleshing it out, you're looking at angles, you're reading, you're trying to come up with illustrations. Talk about that process from Monday to Friday or maybe even Saturday night. What does that look like and how does that play out through the week?
Yeah. Well, I am an end of the week putting it down on paper. Like probably Friday is when I'm going to finish up my sermon on paper. But when I have, usually on Monday, I'm thinking about what am I going to talk about next week? If I haven't already sometimes I do a schedule ahead when I have just a cluster of ideas and I've got it all planned out, so I know what I'm preaching next year. I've done about 5 or 6 years where I planned the entire year ahead of time. I tried it. I didn't really like it. It was really good for defeating the battle of what am I going to preach. But I felt like sometimes I was stuck doing something that I didn't think was as timely as something else could have been because you don't know what the future holds. So, but I do try to plan in smaller chunks, so I'm not going week by week, but I do have maybe a month or two that I'm looking at. But on Monday through, Thursday or so, I'm gathering material. I'm thinking about it in my head. I know what I'm going to do, but as I'm reading and listening, and I'm jotting stuff down through the week. Sometimes I jot it down. Sometimes I just leave it in my mind. And I probably regret that more often than not because I haven't written anything down. But I don't write anything down in a formal way. If I do write something down, it's just a thought. But then on Friday, that's when I sit down and I try to, properly outline the lesson and get everything ordered. I'm not into alliteration and writing, that's really distracting to me.
Me
But if
too.
you can have 3 points to a sermon that begin with the same letter or begin with, we walk with God by, we walk with God by, all 3 points have that similar, it's easier for people to remember. And
Yeah.
so I do try to um, work on some of those things that maybe sometimes involves a thesaurus, trying to get things. And I'm not so married to that or wedded to that I make, there are some words that fit that nobody knows what they mean. I'm not going to run there. Again, the
Right.
job is to communicate. But on Fridays, I get my sermon down in proper outline form. I've been handing out my sermon outlines for 30 years, I guess now.
Hmm.
It's a skeleton, but I put it out. People pick it up when they come into the building. It's not one of those you have to fill in the blanks. I give them, basically my outline that I'm going to be preaching from. And then you got the sermon prep. We do PowerPoint, very
Right.
rarely do I not do PowerPoint. And so you have that to finish. I don't know if you guys do, but we subscribe to Igniter Media. Um,
Hmm.
we get a lot of things there. And I have some Photoshop skills that I see a picture that I want that's better than what Igniter has, and I'll just create it into a PowerPoint slide. And
Yeah.
that's I probably do more of that than actual the Igniter Media slides. But so that's what I do. The week is I'm mulling things over. I'm meditating. I'm thinking about angles. And then on Fridays, when I really sit down and start to put it down in an outline form and get it put together.
Yeah, see, I said it before. That's just fascinating to me because, and that's why I wanted to have you on and why we have different guests each week, because there's way more than one way to skin this cat, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But, and they all work. And if they work, fine. I'm one that I want to get it done. And once I get it down and done, I want Friday to kind of just be a
Yeah.
relaxing day,
Yeah.
finish up anything. But Friday's your busiest day, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty busy. But here's what happens. And I've tried the Monday thing. I've tried the early week. I get the thing done. And then by Saturday, like, I don't want to preach that. I get that. Like, I'm not feeling it. And it's
Right.
hard to preach something when you're not feeling it. And so
Absolutely.
it seems like every time I did one of those early week sermons, by the end of the week, I'm not into it like I was. And I think that sometimes you can pick up on that if you're listening, whether a guy is really passionate or, just presenting material. And so that's another reason why I choose to wait till the end of the week, because it allows me some time to change my mind if I need to.
How often, because I'm sure you've done this, we all have, if we preach for any length of time, how often do you come up with a thought or an idea from your study on, say, Monday, and by the time you get to Friday, you go, I can't preach this. I thought
that
this,
happens
I
all
thought
the
this would work. I thought this would work, but I'm going to
Yeah.
have to just scrap it and start over.
Yeah, I do that. I do that periodically. And that book that I have, the books that I have of things that I've jotted down, I have dozens and dozens of ideas that I've never preached. It hit me in the moment, when I wrote it down because I thought it was something, but then I don't want to do anything with that, now. But then some of those things that I haven't wanted to do, I'll go scan back through my books, and then I'll like, oh, that's good. And it's
Yeah.
something that I'd rejected before. So
Yeah.
it's weird. I don't know.
Yeah.
I
No,
think some of it has to do with where we are, and what we've been thinking about at the time.
That is one of the side benefits I looked at after leaving a work for 14 years in Abilene, coming to Tennessee, thinking I've got 14 years worth of sermons. How incredible is this going to be? I can just pull from that arsenal, rework them a little bit. And what I found out is that at least half of those in the arsenal, I'm thinking, why did I preach that? That's
Yeah.
terrible.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. And I'm saying the same thing. I've got 40 years of them, and I've looked back. People say, well, that shouldn't be any problem. You don't have to do that every week. I don't want to preach what a lot of them. I just, even though I've had 40 years, I want to put in the work every week to do, to present the sermons.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Well, so Steve, talk about this. You've got everything settled. You come to Friday. Friday is over. Everything's ready to go. What do you do to make certain that your presentation or your delivery is on point?
Yeah. Well, when I first started preaching, I stood in front of a mirror. I did that for a few times, but that lasted maybe, a couple months.
Right.
I really don't do a whole lot of preparation with delivery. I try to be very conversational, and I feel like sometimes when I try to do that kind of preparation and say things just right and be this, I've got some preacher friends that are wordsmiths. They say just the right word. But if that were me, it would sound stiff. I think it wouldn't be real. And so I speak conversationally, and so I'm not worried about the perfect presentation of the material that I have. I will say this: when it comes to sexual issues, I'm really careful. I take time to make sure that what I have to say is well scripted. In fact, I don't manuscript. But I do manuscript those types of sermons because I don't want to be found reaching for words, and then grabbing the wrong one and offending somebody's sensitivities. So when I'm talking about those kind of things, you've got a mixture of gender, you've got a mixture of age, you've got people that don't want you talking about things to their, that when their children are in the assembly. So that's a minefield, and I want to make sure that what I say is exactly what I wanted to say. So with those kinds of those sermons, which aren't often, but periodically, we live in a hypersexualized culture, and you're going to have to deal with those type of issues. But so I'll manuscript those, and I'll spend time memorizing almost word for word those sermons. But other than that, I just take a real skeleton outline with me to jog my memory if I need it. I learned that from many years ago when I was a kid. We had a young men's night on Wednesday night, and there was a man. He was a full-grown man, had a family, and he got up as the very first time he had gotten up. He was a new convert, and he had memorized his sermon. And I remember my dad saying, well, you need to have some notes with you. He said, no, I've got it memorized. And so he got up there and he said, my topic for tonight is go a little further. And he was just blank. And then he said, my topic for tonight is go a little further. And he just stood there. And he said that probably 6-7 times. And one of my friends sitting next to me said, I wish he would go a little further. We were all laughing. But that experience that he had, once it came to him, he was fine and he finished and did a great job. But I'm always afraid of forgetting. And so I just have that real skeleton. It fits in my Bible. It's small.
Yeah.
But I take that up with me.
Well, and that's kind of gets back to what we said a while ago about, this negative connotation associated with illustrations or storytelling or whatever. I've heard the same thing about notes, that there's this negative connotation attached to notes that, well, and certainly we don't want to just get up there and read it like it's a book report or something. But at the same time, notes aren't a bad thing. Yeah. It's not bad to have notes, especially when it's a sensitive topic like that. I know on the podcast, there's certain podcasts where there's very little preparation because I know and the guest knows what we're going to talk about and it's off the cuff and it's easy to talk about. But, when we do podcasts with sexuality or abortion or something like that, we take a whole lot more time to prepare for that. And the same way with sermons and things of that nature. So having notes as a safety net is certainly not a bad thing.
Right. Yeah.
So Steve, as we close here, any advice? I mean, if you could tell preachers, peers, one thing about preaching or to help them in preaching, what would that one piece of advice be?
Well, can I give you a couple real quick?
Absolutely.
Number one, don't plagiarize. I'll just tell you this. There was a man who, for every Sunday for a decade, preached the sermon a week behind me. Like, I preach a sermon this week, he'll preach the exact same thing next week, including my illustrations, and saying that those things happened to him.
Wow. Okay.
Standing in the pulpit doesn't give you the right to lie. Do your own work. And sure, learn from others, get resources from others, but don't be guilty of this kind of a thing, because it's an ethical matter that has something to do with your relationship with God. The second thing that I would say is just focus on being a good communicator. I had a friend, he was my teacher when I was a kid. We had this really cool guy, and everybody loved him as a teacher in Bible class. And he went off to preaching school, and he came home on a Christmas break or something like that. And so the elders asked him to preach, and the whole youth group sitting over there, and we're excited about. And he got up and he said, "Good morning, brethren." And, had this where did that come from? That wasn't who that guy was. And just be yourself. Don't try to mimic people. And I prefer that you speak to people conversationally. I think that that's what most people accept in this day and time. If you're yelling at people, that'll get old pretty quickly for them. Maybe we could do that in times past, but I don't think we live in that time anymore. So don't show off. Don't try to impress people with your knowledge. You're not the focus that morning. Jesus is, and always keep that in mind. I'm going to read this because I won't remember it, but what a few years ago, I was trying to sum up for the students what they need to be as a preacher. And here's what I came up with. You need to have the knowledge to be truthful, the patience to be kind, the courage to be bold, the wisdom to be balanced, and the humility to be simple. And I think that sums up pretty well what we need to be in the pulpit.
No doubt. And I totally agree with everything you said, especially the point about being genuine and conversational and things of that nature, because I think we've all, seen ministers, not even in churches of Christ, even outside of our brotherhood, who it's like they got in character. It's like you're a caricature, or, you put on that suit and it's an alter ego. Right. It's, now I'm superhero, whatever. And it's, you can just sense that, you're playing a character when I think your family, your church family relates to you so much better when they feel like this is someone who is relating to me and a family member that is talking to me about this, and not somebody who is trying to be aloof or maybe above, or trying to be so formal that maybe it seems disingenuous, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for being on today. This is great information that I hope will be helpful. And I want to encourage our audience to continue with this series over the next few weeks. We're going to be, talking to other ministers that, most assuredly we'll probably do things differently than Chris or Steve. But, I think, like we said earlier, there's more than one way to skin this cat. And I hope that this is helpful. And Steve, I know that you have been helpful to me and many others. And I just appreciate your contribution to the kingdom.
Well, I appreciate it. I enjoy talking about this topic, and I hope people will find it helpful.
Yeah, and I just want to tell our listeners and our viewers also, if you have a specific question about today's episode, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. And if you have a specific question for Steve, we'll forward it on to him, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. If you want further information from him or us, we would certainly be glad to pass it on to you as well. Steve, thanks again for being on. Appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you too.
Absolutely. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.